Thanks, Shelley. Hi, my name is Tim Pletcher. I'm the Executive Director for the Michigan Health Information Network. And we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, in addition to the whole business of health information exchange, money. Advanced payment models, in theory at least, are going to be one of the big motivators for getting people to share things that they haven't historically shared or had a motivation to do it. So we have three folks who are going to speak to us a little bit about the sort of transformation that's underway from pay for volume to pay for value. First is Dr. Tricia Baird, a medical director from Priority Health. Dr. Baird serves as medical director at Priority Health, one of Michigan's fastest growing health plans, serving nearly 800,000 members. She has a distinguished career in sort of making change happen, I guess would be the easiest way to sort of phrase that. She received her BS from Ball State, her MD from Indiana University, and an MBA from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and she's a fellow of the American Academy of Family Practice. Next, we'll have Phillip Bergquist speak. He's the manager of policy and strategic initiatives with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Phillip's worked at aligning a wide range of things when you look through the list at DHHS. Some might be familiar with his sort of work around health policy, and he spent some time as a director of health center operations for the Michigan Primary Care Association. So he's got sort of time in both the real world and the sort of more policy space. He received education at the University of Kansas, and he was, at Rochester College, and an executive fellowship at the University of Kansas. He was recognized nationally as a 2011 Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Excellence in Children's Health Outreach and Enrollment honoree, and in 2012, a nominee for the Geiger-Gibson Emerging Leader Award. And our third speaker will be Dr. Tom Simmer. Dr. Simmer is the Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. He also happens to be a MIHIN board member. It didn't say that in here. I added that just in case, folks. Dr. Simmer oversees Blue Cross Blue Shield's medical policy, professional payment policies, and some of their national programs to improve quality, cost, and access to medical services. He's very much considered a sort of physician's physician when he goes out into the field and talks to more than 25,000 physicians throughout Michigan. He is one of the principal leaders in the sort of formation and leadership of the Michigan Quality Improvement Consortium, MQIC. And prior to joining Blue Cross, he served as the Vice President for Health and Medical Affairs to the Health Alliance Plan of Michigan. He graduated from Wayne State University School of Medicine and got his bachelor's from the University of Michigan. He's also a fellow in the American College of Physicians. With that, we will turn things over to Tricia, and then we'll, at the end of this panel, let you all ask questions.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you this afternoon, and I also appreciate the struggle we're under as the insulin curve is peaking over your dessert. So if anyone needs to stand up in the back of the room or stretch, I prefer that to snoring, so feel free. I have the pleasure of spending about 10 minutes giving you a 20,000-foot view in a way that might inform new program details as we shift to this fee for value. I hope that you take away from this the clinical asks. To use Jeff Chang's example, it's your job as IT leadership to build the vehicle, but really a clinically driven, a driver of that vehicle are clinicians who may or may not be willing, aware, or fully embracing of this switch. And so from very evolved members of our network who are asking for these things, it really benefits us greatly to have a multi-payer approach inside of CPC Plus and to have a broad similarity in the network approach to where we're going. It will speed our journey to success. These asks are coming from the network to us as payers often, but truly you can provide many of these data factors to your facilities and providers with less noise and more speed. And with that, not an insulin curve. This is actually Kaiser Family Foundation data. It starts in 1999, and the bottom two lines show that into-pocket revenue to the average working family is tracking with inflation. The top two lines are the cost of healthcare and the out-of-pocket costs for healthcare. So while the in-pocket cost is at the bottom of that graph, the out-of-pocket cost for families is at the top. And if you notice the gap between those two pairs of lines, the graph you see ends in 2005. This was 2012. That gap is more than twice grown in that 7-year period, and I don't think any of us believe that it has gotten smaller in the last 4 years. So that has caused a call to action and a reboot of the healthcare payment framework. Fee-for-service was felt to be a big driver of that gap. So if any of you have been watching national politics in the last year or so, it feels like that reboot was heard loud and clear, and we are being asked to continue the work to convert from fee-for-service as a root cause of that gap to more risk payment arrangements. But it's our job in many ways as payer structures to make that jump achievable or possible or even conceivable. To level set with the definition, an alternative payment model is an approach that gives incentive payments for high quality and cost-efficient care. Different clinical conditions like inpatient and outpatient, acute and chronic events, care episodes like planned and unplanned events, and populations as determined by the structure of the population change the opportunities of the clinical care in that group, and they certainly change your IT design. An advanced APM has an additional cap. If the clinical group is willing to take some risk for the outcomes, there is an additional potential for benefit. So you hear us talk about upside risk, which is if you do poorly, it doesn't if you do poorly, it doesn't reflect on you, and if you do well, you can get an upside. A upside downside risk is you can get more of an upside, but if there is a loss in the total cost of care, the organization is on the hook for that as well. This, as you can imagine, is an incredibly large body of work and conversion. And the good news is there are lots of opportunities. So if you don't already have a sense of how you want to build an IT vehicle to support fee for value as opposed to fee for service, I hope you can write down at least 10 ideas that are specific to your setting as we're talking today. And if I was in a military room, I would call this a target-rich environment. The bad news is, apparently, it's complicated. Who knew? I got so many texts from my family the day that this broke out. They're so tired of hearing from me how complicated it is. Architecture matters. So this is where we start to get to your individual setting. These are very local decisions. Although we will end up at the same final resting place, where we start matters greatly. So a firm working base of 2 or 3 exchanged of data connections that reliably work is a great foundation to build on a future state. And I would always suggest defining what that future desired state is for your local area is the best place to start, and then determining what success looks like at each step. You hear me offering lots of different use cases, and even though you may build for a small number of use cases in the beginning, having the ability to flex and contain future states or additional needs can be very, very helpful to keep you from losing momentum by having to reset to a different technology vehicle when you finally have that cultural buy-in and the clinical momentum. Think about data pushes and data pulls. We've heard this multiple times. The end of this morning, someone mentioned that there is 1 school nurse for every 4,000 Michigan students. Think about how that nurse would want to receive or send data differently than an inpatient social worker, different than a skilled nursing facility, different than people who actually hold data sets like social determinants in a skilled facility that we haven't even thought of in an inpatient facility environment, but are going to become increasingly more valuable. If your technology has the ability to let people push or pull, receive or hold, it becomes a much more comfortable clinical user experience. Think of in the same way about access and control. Who needs to be able to read it? Who needs to be able to modify it? How does that change the integrity of the content? Those types of architectural details are honestly things I never gave a thought to when I had a stethoscope on every day, all day long. But that's the key, one of the key skills that your expertise adds to the usability at the clinical interface. The pattern recognition. You guys know this. Clinicians don't remember this very often. So turning data into knowledge, and when you hear clinicians talk about being overwhelmed with unusable data points, it's an even more key skill as we move from fee for service to alternative payment mechanisms to actually glean wisdom from these data points instead of just a flood of data. The multi-layered data sets will also allow for some unique capabilities as we're moving forward. So, if anyone's bought any kind of tickets lately and it asks you to identify 4 of the 8 pictures that have a gas station in them, you can do something a computer can't. And they've been trying to teach computers for a decade. I'm probably preaching to the choir. Pattern recognition. But once clinicians can recognize a pattern, that pattern can be scaled by technology. I find myself repeating over and over that there's a clear difference there. Difference between creating a significant pattern and then scaling that pattern. And that may be a question that you want to present to your clinical partners, because that distinction is often lost in innovation. However, the more data sets you layer on, you have the ability to pull and aggregate patterns if a wise clinician has given you that pattern that we're pulling from. And that can turn multi-layered data sets into very exciting, agile, helpful things, rather than very overwhelming bodies of data that you're almost fighting to get over so that you can get through a clinical encounter. Bonus points are given in alternative payment mechanisms for data systems that increase the timeliness or the proactive stance of the data. I also have to remind myself that the first thing it seems that we used IT for in healthcare was to pay bills. And when you're paying a bill with IT, it is very important that you are 100% right, but it doesn't matter at all how fast you do it. That needs to reverse itself quite a bit. And so the more you have to undo that, do I need the entire ER record, or do I just need to know the day after the visit that who was there, when they were there, and maybe what they thought was wrong. But if you just tell me who was there and when they were there, is that enough for me to run on? Or are we trying to throw 16 pages of a progress note through the system? So it's a very different mindset as we're getting into this forward stance of a proactive model. All right, I promised I would talk about APMs. Here's the Wheel of Fortune slide. This is an eye chart. You can find it if you Google it. This is the CPC Plus visual for what they are going for. If you look very carefully, oh, it works. If you look very carefully, this gray, oh, I can't get it, the gray wheel across the top, you see the light blue, the dark blue, and then that gray arc. Those are the 5 functions of CPC Plus. So if you have a CPC Plus facility and you don't know your IT needs yet, go look up the 5 functions, but I'm going to talk my way through them. The first is access and continuity. So the right care at the right time. We've had that conversation a little bit already. Care management, you've had that conversation as well. You're going to see risk stratification and event triggers become a much more important function in CPC Plus with regard to care management. Comprehensiveness and continuity, transitions of care will continue to be important, but in addition to medical needs, you will see a bigger draw on behavioral health needs and social determinants of health. Function 4, patient and caregiver engagement. I can tell you from the lovely lunch that I had, you are going to hear some wonderful things tomorrow from some of your speakers about patient and family engagement, so I will leave that there. Planned care and population needs, evidence-based care and running protocols, and the difference between fee-for-service medicine, which I like to call come-and-get-it medicine, versus true population health. So today, a decade ago, if you called my office and waited on through the voicemail or left a message and kept presenting yourself to our doorstep, either verbally or physically, we would see you and take care of whatever you said was wrong. 5 years ago, we got a little better at, when you showed up on our doorstep, looking at all the things you might have gaps in and taking care of them. But true population health management is finding that 10 or 15% of people that say, you say I have diabetes. Oh, your pancreas says so too. They may not believe that they have medical needs. They may not believe, they may be more consumed with their social determinant or their behavioral health needs. They may have a different focus than we do, but we have not done a great job of going out and reaching out and finding that silent 10 or 15% in a risk arrangement, in a true population health arrangement with dollars on the table. We have got to consistently find those folks that don't come to us for that come and get it version of healthcare. There are 3 ways that people get paid in CPC Plus. The first is traditional fee-for-service payment. The second is a care management fee, which again, that risk adjustment element, both maximizing your risk adjustment and knowing who has a high risk score so they can be managed. That will become a key piece and a piece that IT can really help with pattern recognition. And then third, there are performance-based incentives, ECQMs, electronic clinical quality measures. They have both a utilization and a quality component. We could be here for 4 hours if I went into that, but there is truly a lovely YouTube video that CMS put out. It's about 20 minutes long. By the 5th time you watch it, you can do it right along with her, and it is really, really hard to actually operationalize. So I would refer you to that video. It's worth a multiple watch. Interoperability. You get bonus points in alternative payment mechanisms for figuring out how to wisely wind through risk adjustment, emergency department visits in a timely manner, inpatient care, again, in a timely manner for transitions of care. And then if you think your system's built well, think about how a new chronic disease diagnosis would flow through those notifications, how an acute event that may not have a chronic element would flow through that design. And this is a kind of a good list to pressure test your system for future needs or more mature needs. Lastly, I've heard it just a few times, and Phillip's eyes are lighting up every time I say social determinants of health. If you really feel like you've gotten the whole rest of the list crossed off and you want to go for extra bonus points, dig into the social determinants of health work. It is as difficult as the behavioral health layer on medical. We are very fortunate in Michigan that there is a statewide grant to deal with, or to bring, they're called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, into the state as a whole. So if you've got a free hour, start with social determinants of health and then add ACEs. It's really kind of master's and PhD level work in this IT structure. But when you, in brief, when you think about social determinants like food, for Medicaid, it might be more of a question of food deserts or availability of vegetables and produce. For Medicare populations, it can be, my wife died and I don't know how to even boil water. I can't cook for myself. Those are very different ends of that spectrum. For economic stability, it could be a ride to an appointment. But for working families, it may look more like medical home access outside of the hours in which I need to work. Are they accessing the ER for care simply because they're open before and after work? Health literacy, cultural literacy, the social determinants are a deep and wide bucket and can again augment the work if you feel like you've achieved everything that, that high-performing organizations have. I hope I didn't overwhelm you. but I wanted everyone to really have an opportunity to have a good 5 or 10 things to work on, whether you're starting from scratch or whether you really are a highly organized, well-performing organization, because I know those are represented here as well. This is fabulous work. And while we all thought 10 years ago, who can run an entire device off of one button, I couldn't live without my iPhone now. So how do we take all the complexity and design it into simplicity in a user interface that feels intuitive, that works for all the needs, the providers, the consumers, the networks, and the organizations? I can't think of a better group to try that challenge. So best of luck to all of you.
Good afternoon. So when I was on the phone with Dr. Baird and Dr. Simmer the other day, they said they were both going to talk about models of care and elements of models of care and even talk about requirements and important things to focus on. And I thought, I just get to talk about the policy part of it? This is awesome. But before I do that, and this is something that I actually hang in the office in my office on the wall now and again to remind myself, and then also use it to remind one another of what we talk about when we talk about alternative payment methodologies really is using a payment methodology to support something bigger than payment. And that's a consistent theme hopefully you're going to hear from everybody who talks about payment with you and everybody you talk about payment with, is that there's a lot of stuff going on in healthcare, and that change requires mutually reinforcing things. Payment is one of those mutually reinforcing things. And if to cap it off, that wasn't enough, our folks and friends in the Healthcare Payment Learning and Action Network adopted a set of core principles that reflects that very strongly. And that's those 4 boxes you see up there. Some of my kind of favorites are on this screen. There's about 10 more of them, depending on how you look at all of them. But these 4 are 4 that I really keep in mind as we think about this, and they're good to put in front of ourselves as we think about what we're trying to accomplish with payment, what we can do with an alternative payment methodology, and then really what are the limitations. So things like understanding that changing the way we pay for healthcare is not going to fix healthcare all by itself. Seems like a simple thing, but just to write it down and reflect on that when we talk about how we pay for healthcare. We're not trying to solve or make all improvements with one lever. This is one of those pieces. So I always like to start there so we have the context going in before we talk about payment in general. And this is going to be your audience interaction portion of the presentation. But just a quick show of hands if you have heard of or seen the alternative payment methodology framework before today. Okay. Lots of folks. I think we're about 70%, I would say. So what's great about this alternative payment methodology framework is that it gives us a way to talk about alternative payment methodologies that's slightly less confusing than the way we talked about it before. And this alternative payment methodology framework has been around for a little while now, but actually right now, as we speak, is going through a round of comments on an update. So when this slide says revised common language, it's really reflecting on the fact that that alternative payment methodology framework that we've all gotten used to has had a couple of updates and a couple of changes around the edges to reflect the way that alternative payment methodologies have changed over time. So for folks that are less familiar, there's 4 categories. Within those categories, there are letters. So you'll see in a future version in this slide deck a 2A, a 2B, and a 2C. No more 2D. That one went away in the refresh. Only 2C now. Or a 4A, a 4B, and 4C. That 4C is new. It wasn't in the previous version of the APM framework. There are also N letters. So you'll see a 3N and a 4N. Anytime there's an N, it's good to think of it as a no or a not good. So an N is a payment methodology that usually means it's missing a link to quality, and those are the payment methodologies that the framework really tries to deprioritize and eventually move away from. So I'm going to use the framework to talk about alternative payment methodology, kind of landscape and environment the rest of the way through. But I want to start with a little bit of crystal balling. This is everyone's favorite thing to do, is sort of where are we headed, what's going on next. No one knows for sure, but again, friends at the Learning in Action Network took a stab at it in this most recent version of the APM framework. And what they thought in the APM framework, just to orient ourselves, the left side being where we are today, and the right side where we're moving in the future. And the size of those bubbles relates to the amount of money that we spend as a healthcare system through that mechanism. So a really good, I think one of the things I like to use as kind of an example and a good way to think about this is when we move from the left side to the right side, if the size of the bubble changes, say we go from that big looming orange thing that is fee-for-service to the right side where the fee-for-service dot is that big, that money has to go somewhere, right? The money doesn't disappear, it just gets put into a different circle. And the size of those circles on the right-hand side is really a guesstimate or a prediction, if you will, of where these payment methodologies fall in the future. So things like 2C, payment category 2C, which represents pay for performance, growing significantly. Things like category 3B, which is a downside risk containing payment model, growing much more than what we have today. And then in general, category 4, the circles, especially A and C, getting larger in category 4 to reflect population-based payments compared to where we are today. So I looked at the bubble chart. We've been thinking a lot about this lately, and I decided I'd take a stab at if we were to Michiganize that, what might it look like? And I did it with arrows and the more complicated version of the chart, but we'll walk through it because I think there's some really important stuff in here as well that can be useful in thinking about how do these payment models evolve over time to achieve the clinical goals that we're all trying to achieve. So first things first, in category 2, in the near term, and right now, we're seeing a kind of an increase in category 2A payments. Those are infrastructure-related payments, right? So these are things that usually manifest themselves in fixed fees or per member per month style payments, and that's due to some specific programs and specific initiatives. CPC Plus, as you mentioned, in addition to the SIM PCMH initiative and quite a few other payer programs making those infrastructure type of payments. So we see a short-term increase there. The arrow is hollow in this case because that increase is not likely to go on forever. So when we think near term, next 2-3 years versus 10 years from now, will we be seeing that same increase? Probably not. When we think about pay for reporting, and I love the distinction between pay for reporting and pay for performance, that pay for reporting aspect of it, we really see trending down, and some of that happening already. So the simple mechanism of we'll pay a fee for you to report that information or for you to do the service, regardless of how the service actually performed, as a payment methodology going down. And then when it comes to pay for performance, it's my most complicated series of arrows. So there's an arrow without a middle or an arrow outline on it to show in the near term, there's some pretty big gains to be seen in pay for performance methodologies. CPC Plus has a pay for performance aspect. Almost every commercial payer has a pay for performance aspect with lots of different names. And over time, that change and some of the near-term increase will likely hold steady. But the kind of current way of thinking about this category is that the mix of providers that are really taking part in that 2C pay for performance methodology will change over time. So as providers change and it kind of go through a continuum of advancing through these different payment methodologies, some of the folks that are in 2C today or next year or the year after that will move to category 3 payments and category 4 payments. But for some providers, 2C may be the sweet spot. That may be the place that they stay for a long time. And that mix will change over time. So the overall spend may be different, but it will probably be more likely to be a change in providers in there over time. Big things going on in Category 4, lots of solid upward-facing arrows over there. Those are population-based payments. They don't all mean full capitation arrangements. In fact, I think the most growth that both CMS has seen in this area, in the national data that's been reported by payers as a part of the CMS LAN, or Learning Action Network, has reflected more condition-specific and smaller kind of sub-capitation arrangements, where for a specifically defined set of services, there's a population or an overall payment. Not a lot of the very fully integrated models here, and a lot of that growth is happening more in specific types of payment methodologies related to a group of services or a condition or something along those lines. The ends at the bottom, I don't know what to call this symbol, the don't park here, you'll get a ticket, or no smoking, or something like that. Those 3N and 4N, no link to quality methodologies, where, for example, you get a lump sum of money, and that's how much money you get, and there's no quality measure, there's nothing along those lines, kind of old school, no quality links. Those payment methods seem to be disappearing entirely. So they're melting away, slowly but surely. So as I was thinking about kind of this presentation and how APMs are fitting in the context of what we're doing today, certainly as payers, as providers, as folks that are thinking about policy and the landscape around this, these alternative payment methodologies are really only important in the sense that they help you achieve your goals and help all of the stakeholders that are involved in the healthcare system achieve their goals. So one of my favorite questions to ask myself every time we think about what's the next iteration or the next evolution or the next opportunity for us when it comes to moving ourselves in that advanced payment methodology or alternative payment methodology continuum is, how does it reinforce high-value care? And I answered these questions for myself when I was putting together this presentation more generally about some of these categories. How does something like a 2A infrastructure payment help somebody provide better care? Well, it could support the care team composition that really provides greater coordination, or it could support infrastructure, for example, health information exchange infrastructure that helps care teams have more information. How could something like a Category 3 payment, say a upside, downside shared savings arrangement, support someone? One of the ways that it could do that is provide a benchmark. It's hard to know if you're doing well if you don't know what well is. It's hard to know if you're delivering care effectively and efficiently if you're not sure what all that data is to bear it out. And that's one of the advantages of a Category 3 arrangement, is it really puts that data front and center. How much does something cost? How much should it cost? What's a good benchmark to use in measuring that? How do we know where we stand? When it comes to Category 4 arrangements, there's a lot more flexibility for care teams to make decisions about meeting their patients' needs. So when we think about a population-based payment, not a payment that's based on do this specific thing and get paid, there's opportunities for care teams to say, you know what, our patients' need isn't necessarily always that 15-minute visit with a provider. Sometimes what they need is a visit with 6 peers to talk about how to eat differently when they're newly diagnosed with diabetes. And these are all questions that you can answer for yourself. But most importantly, and I think the part that I always have to challenge myself with is when a payer comes to you, or when I come to you, or when anyone comes to you to talk about payment, if we can't answer this question of how does what we're doing in changing payment reinforce high-value care, or make it easier, or make it better, or really create an opportunity to improve care delivery, why would we do it if we can't answer that question correctly? Last piece that I wanted to talk just a little bit about are some things that are going on in a very Michigan-centric landscape. So Dr. Baird talked about CPC Plus. I imagine Dr. Simmer will a little bit as well. CPC Plus has grown significantly in Michigan. Lots of folks that are coming in to that program. Lots of different payment options that are making up CPC Plus. When it comes to the state innovation model, the PCMH initiative has grown significantly over, especially especially as compared to some of our multi-payer advanced primary care demonstration involvement. So we've been able to add a lot more folks into the program, new practices, new providers participating, new beneficiaries and patients receiving services. There's a lot of evolution to come in both of those programs. So CPC Plus is newly started. The SIM PCMH initiative is newly started, and they're both programs that still have a lot of evolving left to do. So I think the important thing to think about those two programs is where we are today is probably not where we'll be in 5 years. We have a lot to learn from both of those experiences still. The last piece that I'll spend a little bit of my time on is on that thing in the middle box at the top, which is Medicaid alternative payment model and alternative payment strategy goals. So this is something that is new to Michigan's Medicaid program in the format that it's taking right now, but representative of work that's been happening for a long time. And there's one more audience participation part of this, which is, can anybody remember or have you heard of the Medicare's program's alternative payment methodology goals? And just as a reminder, I'll give you a little hint. They sound something like, we'll get to X percentage of alternative payments by such and such a date. These seem familiar to you at all? Only a couple of people. So Medicare set those goals for the program as a whole, and that's part of the emphasis of the alternative payment methodology drive that you see in large-scale programs like CPC Plus, the Medicare ACO or Shared Savings Program in MACRA, is to really help Medicare as a program and as a payer achieve a large-scale amount of their payments flowing through alternative payment methodologies by certain time periods. In Michigan's Medicaid program, we've not had similar goals to that up until a very recent point in time where we started talking about how we would set those goals. So, how would we set goals? How would we measure that type of information in our managed care space in Michigan? How could we think about options and sort of state-preferred models that would provide greater consistency to providers that work with multiple Medicaid managed care entities? And what's the sort of quality infrastructure that would need to be around those alternative payment goals to really move it forward? And I'm excited to say that we've taken some pretty big steps when it comes to those broader Medicaid payment strategic goals over the course of the last few months. And later this week, if not Friday, it will be next Monday, we'll be releasing a request for information. So you guys can be on the lookout for an RFI coming from MDHHS that's focused on provider interests, and I would define that broadly. So provider organizations, if you're working in a practice environment versus a PO environment versus a health system, maybe a pharmacy, a behavioral health provider, it's the whole gamut. But an RFI coming forward for providers to weigh in on how those goals can shape up for the Medicaid program and the specific payment methodologies that you're interested in seeing expanded over the course of the next 3 years. And then coming in October, each of our partners in those Medicaid managed care organizations will have a goal. And MDHHS is really excited to be working with all of those organizations, to be working really closely with Medicaid health plans on those goals. But it's not something, it's new. This is really a new opportunity to see a broader space of alternative payment methodologies in the Medicaid program, and to know and kind of have a vision on how we achieve that goal over the course of the next several years. So more to come there, and please be on the lookout for the provider RFI. I think I'll leave it there and have Dr. Simmer come on up.
Tricia started off with her concern that lunch would cause you all to fall asleep during the talk. I'm more concerned that the nature of the topic is going to have your head spinning so fast that you'll just lose your lunch entirely. We're talking about a very complicated thing, and it's not necessarily the thing that you spend your entire days and nights trying to deal with. So I'm going to try to move this up to a level of a lot of generalities and specific, what does it mean for what you need to do differently every day? So first of all, let me start with the acronyms just involved with the federal government's new payment programs. here in Michigan, so I'll include SIM in that. These are just the acronyms. The first thing this teaches you is never try to compete in acronym scramble with someone from CMS. And they have completely unseated the previous reigning championship in that game, which was Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. We are completely outdone with the acronyms. And so when I think that at Blue Cross we have a different payment model for BCN, BCN-A, which is their Medicare Advantage product, PPO programs, Medicare Advantage PPO programs, and Medicaid. All of these programs have different specific payment models. And then when you try to get into that, we also have a CPC Plus arm, and then you have to deal with MACRA, MIPS, and advanced payment models, advanced alternative payment models, accountable care organizations, of which there are a number of types, and so forth. You really realize that the nature of the topic is not in the specifics. You really got to ask, what does this mean on a day-to-day basis? Because you simply can't practice differently, manicuring it to the different payment programs that you face. So I'm going to just say, forget the details. But no one ever follows my advice, so I'll just say, go to the Michigan Academy of Family Practice website if you want to know the details. It's the best one to understand MACRA, MIPS, and all of the reporting. They do an outstanding job. And I think for those of you who really want to get into it more, that's a good idea. And I believe every organization does have to have a few people who are more familiar with it. I don't think they need to be experts, but it is worthwhile to have somebody go through it. But I don't think it's something that everybody needs to understand. I'm going to break the topic down into the quality side and the cost side, because I actually think that the two sides have very different implications, and your approach to doing well under payment models relative to their quality expectations and relative to their cost expectations require different approaches. So what does the quality score? And I like to call it a quality score, because when I go and interact with physicians, which is most days, they are very quick to remind me that the quality score has nothing to do with who's a good doctor and who's a bad doctor. I agree with that. This is not saying whether or not you're a good doctor or a bad doctor. It's saying how well you scored on the measures of quality that exist. And when we get down to answering the question, how do you improve those quality scores, you don't really have to involve the clinician or practitioner much at all. You really have a challenge there that is an administrative challenge. And I will say, for those of you who are supporting administratively practitioners, the quality score is something that you own more than the practitioners in that practice own. When we're talking about meeting the cost expectations, there is a lot more that involves the actual practitioner, because judicious decisions made by a practitioner are important into the cost equation. Thoughtful referrals, where you're actually examining the experience that your patients have had with referring institutions and specialists relative to how many services accompanied that referral, and most seriously, implementing a proactive care process, which is back to what the administrative people in that practice need to consider to be their challenge in partnership with their practitioners. So let's focus a little bit on the quality scores. Where does the information come from? And you have to look at this as an information management problem, and that's how health information exchange fits in. The first thing is if you have an EMR, more and more of the quality score measures rely on information that comes from the EMR, because it doesn't happen to be found in the claims system, which is where prior quality scores actually came from. So now things are, what is the BMI of the patient? What is the blood pressure? Was the blood pressure well managed? Not just did you draw the A1C, what was the A1C, et cetera. So what you see here is we're moving, the payment model is moving to quality scores that rely on information management more than when they only relied on the claim system. So the way you do this is you need to know who are your patients. And that is the same as your ACRES file, your active care relationships file. You need, some people call it your panel. I think I'm old-fashioned, I think panel works fine. But you need to know who are all the people in your panel, and you have to have an information management way of answering the question, what are my routine recommendations for care? What immunization should they have? What screening tests like mammography should they have? What conditions do they have that require things like A1C? It's a process and information management challenge. So you start, and you get that usually from your practice management system. So you identify all of your patients and you create a system for proactively identifying all the services that your practitioners wish to recommend. And of course, that includes just about everything that's on those quality scores. And then you say each patient coming into that office needs to have that information identified and verified, and those recommendations for care need to be implemented on a consistent basis for every patient that comes into that practice every day. It's a process thing. And generally it does involve standing orders so that the practitioners don't need to interrupt the care that they're doing in order to once again emphasize that a routinely recommended service ought to be delivered to the patients. You then need to consider an outreach for the people who haven't come in to see you, because the quality measures do include people who haven't come to see you. For the HMO programs, patients have signed up for the HMO. They've identified practitioners that they want to be associated with. Even though the practice has never seen the patient, the lack of delivery of services is counted negatively on these quality scores. So that means patients that have signed up for you but haven't yet seen you are in fact part of your patient panel or population. Those who have that process in place are not going to have difficulty succeeding in good performance on those quality measures, as long as their good performance is communicated to the health plans, so the health plans have the correct information as to whether or not the service was delivered. That process of getting information to the health plans is a very harrowing experience for most practices, particularly between Halloween, which is less scary than what follows Halloween in terms of information capture, and the beginning of the next calendar year. It's sort of like ruin my holidays plan. But if you are in an ongoing process way, extracting information from the EMR through the process that is under evolution. You heard that it's the QRDA 1 and 3 right now, but it's going to be moving to the FHIR side in having interfaces with all the EMRs that are generalized so that you can get this information out. Work with MyHIN and the Michigan State Medical Society collaboration, PPQC, to make sure that your practice is able to kick this information in order to do well on your quality scores. This will help you whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, Priority, Blue Cross, or whomever. It's an infrastructure that's common to all of these various programs. Quality, now cost. The first things to know is that virtually all of the cost performance evaluations are based on all of the costs that your patients experience in every setting of care. That must be a scary thought to primary care physicians who account for 6% of the total bill, which means although you're earning on 6%, you are being evaluated on the other 94% as well. That's what it means to be a patient-centered medical home. That's what it means that your relationship with the patient extends over time and across settings of care. And in order to do that, you really do need to have your ACRES file in with the information correct. Your information in that ACRES file includes your provider directory information, which, as you heard this morning, you need to have that information complete, or they won't even know if the consent applies to you, and you won't know if you're getting the information that you should. So you have your ACRES file, you get your ADT information, your admission, discharge, and transfer information. You also receive increasingly a clinical document that includes information about medication reconciliation, and you have to have a care process. How many times did we hear this morning that you can't just leave the information in the inbox, you have to bring it in and use it? I know practices that actually have a high risk indicator for all of their patients, and whenever an ADT message comes in that matches that high-risk population, the physician's cell phone gets a text saying, your patient is in St. Mary's Livonia emergency room. Please contact the emergency room. Then they contact the emergency room, and the first thing that happens is the patient says, how did you know I was here? That's how fast that system works. They're actually still there. The physician usually says either, does this patient going to need admission, do you think? If so, the hospitalist for that practice actually comes down and evaluates the patient if that's true, or they ask the patient to be held in observation until the primary care physician can see the patient first thing in the morning, or they arrange for a nurse practitioner to actually come and meet the patient to arrange an alternative process of care that meets the medical needs of the patient without requiring that hospitalization. That's how you manage costs. You prevent costly events. They also, for those people who are going to the emergency room, they have a follow-up process that said, did you know that the very time you went to the emergency room, we had office hours? We are really here for you. Please come to us. It'll be easier for you. It'll be better for all of us. And I think that is one of the reasons why practices who do that do have eventually lower emergency department visits. That's how you control costs. Besides that, though, you really do need to move to a more proactive, team-based approach. And this is the hardest part, the sort of longer-term thing. But there is a care model that was developed on the West Coast called the chronic care model. The references are too far to see, but this is small to see on this, but it's McCall Institute generated this slide, the center part of the slide, and there was also information from the Annals and the American College of Physicians in this slide. But fundamentally, you have to have a more proactive care process. I believe that for every well physical, the patient should be contacted prior to the physical and ask, what are your questions? What do you need to go over? Do we need to go over your medications? Or you've been having problems before the visit? And just like this meeting today took a huge amount of planning to use your time well, the annual visit should do the same thing. And if their primary need is to talk about their medications, they should be speaking perhaps to the pharmacist on the team. If they really don't understand other parts of their care, the nurse may be the most important person for them to talk to because the doctor is there to do a different function. And if they simply need to have their annual blood tests done and all your routine recommendations and they're feeling well, then you need to pull that information together and say, have these blood tests done before the visit so that your visit can actually respond. There are studies that show that people more reliably get those blood tests and recommendations if you schedule them before the visit rather than after. That allows you to have fewer gaps in care and do better on your quality scores. But this planned visit approach is a core theme of the patient-centered medical home model, but it is not one that's very easy to implement, and it's one that you have to keep working on even if you've been a patient-centered medical home for a decade. Thankfully, we get to the summary slide because more or less, this topic is one that would otherwise be unending if we didn't come to the last slide. And the idea here is you know as well as others that most payers have unique quality and cost expectations, and you have to be familiar enough with them to know what core processes need to be in place, and those core processes need to mobilize your administrative support, the information that flows, and with a particular emphasis on identifying all the people in your population and all the services that your practitioners in your practice want those persons to be receiving, a process to get it done reliably. But then it's also an important information management challenge to get that information back to the health plan, not simply in the months of November and December, but throughout the year. In case you want to throw anything, just throw it to that email address or telephone, and I'll be glad to follow up with you. Thank you.
All right, with that, we have a few minutes for questions. So let's get our microphones circulating. I'll ask a quick question while we get started. Is it as bad as it seems, or is this actually leading us someplace that will be better? Because it seems like it's getting more complicated, more complex, and more administrative burden. Or is this a path toward simplifying, or is it getting bigger and uglier, or is it heading someplace that is desirable?
Potentially the way out of the burning house is through the fire, right? It feels complicated because we have a foot in both worlds, and we've heard loud and clear from Americans and American health policy that we can't keep a foot in fee-for-service. But the faster we get through that transition, the less this will feel exhausting, and it does at the delivery level. I completely agree. But we have to get over to that other side in a way that doesn't kill or lose the providers and the consumers of the care.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the only way to leave the house is to go through the fire, as the theme. This reminds me, I think we're at sort of an intermediate stage of technology and addressing these concerns. We can't keep on the way we were, pure fee-for-service and so forth. It's absolutely unsustainable. We have to go to performance-based. In the meantime, my dad, who was driving cars in the 1920s, said that he had to change the brakes after going down a hill. My last car, I didn't have to change the brakes on because I had these great ceramic ones. But the roads in those days didn't like do this down the hill. They did this. And you just, the way you didn't crash is you just kept the brakes on the whole way down the hill. And when you finished down the hill, your brakes were shot. So you kept brakes around like people on bicycles bring spare tires with them. That's how it was back then. Well, we still drive cars, we still go down hills, but the technology's improved. I think we're going to eventually have a good system for dealing with this, and right now we just can survive it while making sure we move forward.
The staging, I think, is really important because we started the alternative payment methodology movement without the systems and the technology and, frankly, the business process in place to be successful. And when everybody knows, right? So whenever we start something without all of those things in place, this is where our pain has come from. And now, if you can think 10 years ago to what health information exchange looked like, where we are today is an entirely different thing. And where we'll be 10 years from now will look entirely different than where we are right now. And we're in that intermediate stage is a really good term for it. That's why it hurts so much. I do think for folks that are ready, if the quicker you take the steps, the quicker sort of you take that journey down the next step, the easier it is to end the world where we live in with both feet, one in each side.
So a quick question, and then we'll turn it over. Is there a magic inflection point? Do you need to be at 10% at risk, 30%, 67%? I mean, is there an inflection point where all of a sudden the mindset changes, that we're really no longer in a fixed fee kind of world? Or is that just wishful thinking on my part?
I think it's all empiric, and I see people changing behavior inconsistently with the amount at risk. Very inconsistent. It depends on the personality of the individuals. It depends on the people who just have a natural orientation to looking ahead and wanting to be prepared 5 years from now versus wanting to be retired 5 years from now. And so I don't think I know of any magic number.
I would ask a detail on a different kind of math. So when I was a full-time family practitioner in a smaller or more rural environment, Medicare and Medicaid were respectively 25 and 10% of my panel. I'm going to use the old word too. 25 and 10%. They were 50 and 25% of my daily work. So when the daily clinical flow flips over to a majority of care inside of a risk model, I don't care how many. I had a ton of folks sitting in a commercial payer structure in my panel, but that wasn't what came to my door every day. That wasn't my throughput. And so you have to think about the flow and where a state in which the alternative payment mechanism flow is the majority of your daily flow. And then how do you handle the folks that are also your responsibility, but not part of your in your hallways flow? That work can be done between or in downtimes or in no-show times. That can be batched. I'm not going to use a whole run of lean language, but it can be approached with a different time frame. I really see that team care mindset flip over when the majority of what's in your hallway each day is in a risk contract, and that can be a very small percentage by high utilization percentage, low actual population of your panel.
Interesting.
Fair?
Great way to think about
Okay.
this. Sure. All right, let's open it up. We got a question out there.
Yep. We probably have time for one quick question.
Let's go to Eva over here. Get her a microphone.
Thanks. I actually don't have a question. I only have a recommendation. For those care managers that are here today that are capturing social determinants of health on those 1,500 forms, the payers should be acknowledging those and already taking into consideration the fact that that documentation is available to you, and we're not being reinforced or actually reimbursed for that.
So that's a sort of billing codes for capturing, or no, what are we talking here?
We're not talking billing codes, we're talking ICD-10s.
Diagnostic codes.
Correct. The diagnostic codes for social determinants have been available for a number of years. You need to start capturing those, you need to start acting on them, and you need to really begin looking at value-based reimbursement based on those SDOHs that we're capturing.
Anybody want to respond?
News to me, Eva. I have to say, although I was the executive responsible for ICD-10 implementation, there was nothing in our plan that related to that. So I'll have to talk to you more and learn more about it in order for us to do our duty.
Yeah, that came up at a Coordinating the Care Coordinators event, that they talked about these diagnostic codes that.
Please come find us.
Okay.
I would just
Good.
say if you are, and you've heard this before, but if you are a SIM PCMH initiative participant and you're using your care management and coordination tracking codes, you can use non-medical diagnoses on those codes. So if you're a PCMH initiative participant and you're sending in a face-to-face care management encounter and you want to send me the ICD-10 code that means extreme poverty or doesn't have an appropriate water source, or that's great, and I'd love to have that information. I know that that's not the case for every payer yet. It's not even the case for all of Medicaid right now. It's certainly not the case for all of Medicare or other folks, but there's a place where you can get started with that. And the coding in ICD-10 is so much better than it was in ICD-9. I mean, it's worlds apart. The specificity and the non-medical diagnostic coding that's available in ICD-10 is really quite good.
Please help me thank our panel.